This is the second part of the Express Sessions exercise. We have completed the first part earlier, where we added support for Express Sessions and use Express Sessions as a way of tracking the users on the server side and recognizing the incoming requests from the users. In this exercise, we are not concentrating so much on Express Sessions themselves, but we will look at a way of extending our Express REST API server to support a new model for registering and authenticating users. So we will introduce a new user model and schema into our application. We already have the /users route on which the Express generator has already mounted a users router. So we're going to leverage that and then update that to support registration of new users, authenticating an existing user, and also logging out a user from our server side. So we'll look at Express Sessions as a way of tracking the users once the user logs in, and then when the user logs out, the session will be removed from the system. So how do we go about doing this extension in this exercise? Let's go and find out. Continuing with our Express REST API server, let's now go into the models and then add a new file named user.js. This is the file where we will create the user schema and the model. We'll create a simple user schema which tracks the username and password, and also a flag that is set to indicate whether the user is an administrator or a normal user. So this is one way of distinguishing among different user types. So in this file, let's first require Mongoose, because we are creating a Mongoose schema, and then we'll create a schema named Mongoose schema, and then we'll say var user. So this is the user schema that we're going to create, and so we'll say new user schema. And the user schema will be defined, as I just mentioned, with three fields in here called username, which obviously would be of the type string, and this is a required field, and this is a unique field. You don't want two users with the same username in your system. So we create the username, and then the second field is password field. Now, of course, you can extend this user schema to allow the user to track their entire profile, but we will do that in one of the later exercises. For the moment, a user is recognized within the system by simply the username and password. So the password is of the type string and then is required. And the third field that I'm going to use is called the admin. So the admin is of the type Boolean, and we'll say default false. So by default, when a user is created, a new user is created, the admin flag will be set to false. You can explicitly set it to true from within your code in order to mark a user as an administrative user. Perhaps you might provide additional privileges to an administrative user, or perhaps allow an administrator user to perform certain operations that normal users would not do so. We'll look at that in one of the later exercises. For the moment, this is the user schema that we have created. Let's create a module out of this and export from this module a Mongoose model of the name user. So this is the Mongoose model, and the schema is the user schema that we have just defined a little bit earlier. So this is how we define our user schema. So now that we have defined our user schema, let's go into the router that has already been set up by Express generator when it generates this Express application. So if you go into the routes folder, you will see this file called users.js. So this users.js file will be extended to create the router. So right there, what I am going to do is to import body parser. And then we'll declare the Express router, and then we'll say also import the user schema and model from models user. And then for the Express router, we'll say router use body parser. So now that we have declared the body parser in there, we're going to leave this part as such. Later on, we will modify this to allow the administrator to be able to retrieve all the users that are registered in the system. But for the moment, we're going to leave that route as such. We will add in a few more routes here. So we'll say router post. So we'll support a post operation on a route called sign up. And as you expect, this sign up route will allow a user to sign up on the system. So this will support the sign up of the user. So we'll say rec res next. And so this would be the router post sign up. The remaining methods will not be allowed on the sign up endpoint. So to access this, since this users router is mounted on /users, so we would specify this endpoint as /users/signup, and this is the endpoint that will be used to sign up new users within the system. So first thing that we will do is use the user method, and the expectation is that for a user to sign up, the username and password will be provided as a JSON string inside the body of the incoming post request. So from the body, since the body would have been already parsed by the body parser, so from the body, we'll first check to make sure that the user with that username doesn't exist within the system. If the user with that username exists, then you're trying to sign up a duplicate user, and that should not be allowed in the system. So we'll say users find one, and then we'll try to find if there is one user with the username that has been selected by the client that is trying to sign up a new user. If the user already exists, then obviously you won't allow the new user to sign up with the same username. So we'll say then user. So this will return the user here, and inside this user field, then we will check for the fact whether the user already exists. And then let me catch the error here. So we'll say catch error, and then next error. So we'll just pass the error on to the error handler there. So if the user, so if this search for the user returns the user field, if user not equal to null, so if the user that is returned by this search is not null, then that means that the user with that given username already exists. So you should not allow a duplicate sign up. So we'll say var error new error, and we'll say user rec body username already exists. So basically you're preventing a duplicate user from signing up, and then we'll say error status 403, this is the forbidden, and then exit, calling the error handler there. Next error. Else, this means that the user doesn't exist, so you should allow the user to be signed up. So in the else part, we will say return user create. We'll create a new user with the username set to rec body username, and then let me put this in the next line so that it's more clear to you, and we'll say password rec body password. Now we already know that the admin flag by default will be set to false, so we're going to leave it as such, and this will let our new user be signed up, and when the new user is signed up, this will return a promise, and inside the then we will handle this promise here. So this will return the promise from this then, and then we'll handle it in the next then here. We'll say then res status code is 200, res set header, and we'll say content type application JSON, and we'll say res JSON status registration successful. And if you want, we can load the user into this reply message here as a property in the JSON. We'll say registration successful. And then if there is an error in this operation, we'll say next error. So that'll handle the error there. If the promise doesn't resolve successfully, then that'll be handled by that. So that's it. So here we have a way for the user to sign up. So for the user to sign up, the user will do a post on /users/signup, and in the body of the message, the client will include a JSON string with username and password properties in that JSON string. That's how you sign up a new user. Now, let's see how we will log in the user. Now, we will still use the express sessions that we have done earlier to track the user. So to log in a user, we'll say router post on the endpoint /login. So on the /login endpoint, we will do a router post. Well, obviously, instead of saying function, you can use the arrow function here for the router post. I'm going to do the same thing here. I've gotten fond of arrow functions, so we'll do an arrow function here. And so for the login, how does the login proceed? So for the login, what we will do is that we will go to the app.js file, and then inside this auth, we were doing the sign up for the user there. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to copy this whole thing because I would be doing all this anyway. So rather, let me copy all the way from this point onwards up to the rec session users. So the if part of rec session users, I'm going to copy and then come into the users.js file, and for the login, that is exactly how I'm going to do the authentication. So we'll say if not rec session user. So that means that the user has not yet authenticated himself. Then you expect the basic authentication as a mechanism for the user to use for authenticating. So we'll say var auth header. If not auth header, then we will raise the error. Otherwise, we will retrieve the username and password from the header. Now, here we were doing if username is equal to admin and password is equal to password. But now what we are going to do is we're going to search in the database to see if that particular user exists. So instead of doing this here, instead of doing this if username and password, we will say user find one, and we'll say username is username. So this property is equal to this username that we have just retrieved, and then we'll say then user. So inside this, then, so I'm going to move this code inside this then, because now what I'm going to check for is, now that I have retrieved the user, I need to check to make sure that this user is exactly what I am looking for. So at this point, we are going to first check to ensure that the user is not null. So we'll say if user is null. So if the user is null, so which means that we couldn't find a user with that particular username. So we will have to return an error here. So let me just copy this part and then paste it in here, and then we'll return saying var new error, and we'll say user space username does not exist. So in this case, this user doesn't exist, so I'm just going to remove this part, and then the corresponding error status would be 403 here. So this is the first part. If the user is null, then we are obviously going to tell that the user is does not exist. The second part we're going to check is else if user password. So which means that the user exists at this point. So the second check that we will do is that the user password is not equal to password. Then we again need to indicate the error there. So the error would be saying, in this case, we'll say your password is incorrect. So that's the second part here. So your password is incorrect. And then the last part will say else. So let me indent this code. So else if user.username is username, which obviously should be true in this case. And then the second part, user.password is equal to password, which also obviously should be correct at this point. But in any case, I'm going to check for that issue here, and this else will not occur at all in this case. So by the time you reach this point, the username should be the same as the username and the password should be the same as the password. But in any case, I put in a double check at that point just to be doubly sure. Then in this case, then we'll say rec.session.user is authenticated. So we will set this to authenticated, and also this one we will say res status code is 200. So we were successfully able to authenticate the user. So we'll say res status code is 200, and then we'll say res set header content type text plain, and res end will just simply send a message saying you are authenticated. That's it. So this covers the then part of the user find one. So first we check that the user is, if the user is null, that means that we couldn't find the user. So we are obviously returning an error saying that the username does not exist. If the user's password does not match the password, so at this point the user exists but the password didn't match, so we'll say your password is incorrect. And then finally, if we reach this point, then the username and password should be correctly identified. So although I don't need this check, but I just put it there in place. And then at this point, I will set the rec session user to authenticate it, and then set the status code to 200, which means that you were successfully able to authenticate the user, and then you can finish at that point. And because this is a then, I will put in a catch at this point. So we'll say catch error, and if the error occurs, then I will simply pass the error over to the next, so that the error handler will be able to deal with the error appropriately. So that finishes off this user find one. Now, this is the case when the rec.session.user is not set. If that is already set, then that means that the user is already logged in. So in this case, the else part here deals with the situation saying we'll set the status code to 200 and the content type to text plain, and then we'll say you are already authenticated. So if you reach this else part, you would come here because the rec.session.user is already not null, so which means that the user has already been authenticated. So which means when you reach this point, then the user has already logged in earlier, so you don't need to verify. So you'll simply say you're already authenticated and then finish off at this point. Okay, so now the last method that we will implement is for logging out the user. So we'll do a router get on /logout. You must be wondering, why do we do a get on the logout rather than a post, which we did on login. On login, you need to submit the username and password. For logout, you're simply logging out yourself from the system. So you don't need to supply any further information because the server already is tracking you based upon your session ID and inside the session cookie here. So that's why we are not explicitly needing to send any further information in the body of the message. So we'll say if rec session, so which means that the session must exist. Otherwise, you're trying to log out a user that has not logged in, so it doesn't make sense. Now the session itself provides this method called destroy. And when you call the destroy method, the session is destroyed and the information is removed from the server side pertaining to this session. So, which means that if the client tries to again send the session information which is stored in the form of a signed cookie on the client side, that will be invalid. So we need a method of deleting the cookie that is stored on the client side. Now this operation will remove the session information from the server side so that the session is no longer valid. So at this point, we'll say rec session destroy, and then we'll say res clear cookie. So the clear cookie is a way of asking the client to remove the cookie, and the cookie name is the session ID. So in the previous exercise, we saw that the cookie was stored with the name as session ID on the client side. So we are asking the client to delete this cookie from the client side in the reply message. And then we'll say res redirect, and we'll redirect it to the home page here. So this is a way of redirecting the user to another standard page. So for example, the home page of your application. So this is the way you would handle the logout of the system. If the rec.session doesn't exist, then that means that you're not logged in. So we'll have to generate an error. So we'll say var error new error, you are not logged in. And we'll set the error status to 403. This is a forbidden operation. And then generate the error to the error handler. That's it. So now you see that we have extended the user's router to support 3 new endpoints: the sign up endpoint, which allows a user to sign up, the login endpoint, which allows a signed up user to log in, and then the logout endpoint, which allows a logged in user to log out of the system. And in the process of logging out, you're destroying the session on the server side. You're also clearing the cookie on the client side so that the client cannot use an expired session to try to contact the server. One minor correction in users.js, this should be var user require ... models / user. Recall that the users.js file is in the routes folder, and then the user.js file is in the models folder, which is up one level and then into the models folder. So this should be ... models / user. So make that minor correction. That's it. We have modified the users.js file. Now the last thing that we need to do is go and fix up the app.js file. In the app.js file, if you browse into the app.js file, you would see that we have this /index here and /users here after the authentication. Now this will not work for us, because if you need to sign up, then the user would sign up and log in before the authorization is confirmed. Anyway, the sign up and login is for the process of signing up. So I'm going to move these two up before the authentication step here. So we're going to move this up into this location. So thereby, an incoming user can access the index file at the slash and also access the user's endpoint without being authenticated. But any other endpoint, the user has to be authenticated. So that is the way we set this up. And inside the function authentication, we'll say if not rec session user, then notice that this place we would not be allowing the user to come in here without the user having logged in. So if not rec session user, then we would simply say you are not authenticated. This authentication has to be done by using the login method here. So I'm going to remove this whole part here. So we'll say if not rec session user, we'll say you are not authenticated, and so we will have to send a 403 here, so which means that you should never come down into this point at all without the user logging in. So we'll say you're not authenticated. Recall that you need to authenticate yourself by doing a post on the /users/login endpoint. So we'll say you are not authenticated. Otherwise, if rec session user is equal to, recall that in the login function in the users.js, we had set the rec session user to the string authenticated. So that is what we're going to be checking for. We'll say rec session, if rec session user is authenticated, we'll say next, else you're not authenticated again, and then we will send back a forbidden message here. That is it. So with this update, my app.js file is also ready. Now, having done these updates, let's go and check how our application works now. Going to the terminal, if your server is running, stop it and then restart your server. My server is not running at the moment, so I'll say npm start and my server should be up and running. Let's now see how we will access the server. Going to Postman, let me do a get on localhost 3000 dishes, and then you will immediately see that it complains saying you are not authenticated. Obviously, I am not authenticated here. Let me try to access just the localhost :3000, and you would see that that route is available for us. Now, of course, we want to first register a user and then log in as the user, and then thereafter get access to the rest of the REST API endpoints. So first, let me register a user. To register a user, I need to do a post to the localhost :3000/users/signup. And for this post message, in the body of the message, I need to include in the body of the message a JSON string with the username. So let me log in myself, and then I'll just use the password as password. This is a valid registration. So when I sign up as a user with this information in the form of a JSON string included in the body of the message, let me see that the header now contains content type application JSON because I have set up the JSON in the body of the message, and then send the post to the signup. And then when I send the post to the signup, you immediately see what is returned by the server here. So you see that the server has returned saying registration successful, and the user itself, it gives me the details of the user here. And so this is a record that exists in my MongoDB. And note that the model type is the user model type that we had set up. So we have the username and the password, and the admin flag, as you can see, is set to false by default. Once we register the user, this user is now a valid user. So let me try to again post the same user and see what happens. So when I post the same user, obviously from the server side, it replies saying this user already exists. So you can see that we have set up our sign up procedure to not allow the user to duplicate register with the same user ID. Okay, so that's the second part. Now let's do a login of the user. To do a login of the user, let me remove the content type, and then I'll also remove the body because for the login that is not required. So I don't fill in anything in the header and then try to log in. When I try to log in, saying, it replies back saying you are not authenticated, you are unauthorized. So now I need to log myself in. So this is where I can use the basic authentication. So in the basic authentication, I'm just going to type in my username and password that I just registered in the previous step, and then update my request, and then do a post on the login. So when I do a post on the login, you see that the server replies saying you are authenticated. So at this point, I can perform the get, put, post, and delete requests on all the other endpoints. So at this point, if I do a get on the dishes endpoint, you would see that this returns the empty field because my database is currently empty at the moment. Let me clear out the authorization and also from the header remove the authorization and then do the get, and it still works just fine. So you can see that I am now able to access the endpoints because I have logged myself in. So now let me do a logout of the user. So we'll say localhost :3000 and logout. Note also that in the cookies, a cookie has been set up with the session ID right there. So that cookie exists on my client side. So now let me log myself out by saying get localhost :3000 users logout. So when I do a logout of the user, you will immediately see that I am redirected to the localhost 3000 endpoint, and also notice that the cookie is gone. So when I look at cookies, you see that the localhost, the cookie is gone because from my server side, when I do the logout, it sends back a rest clear cookie to the client side, and so the cookie is gone. Now, if I try to do a get on the localhost 3000 dishes endpoint, this will not work because I am not authenticated. So this demonstrates to you how you can extend your Express server to allow users to register themselves and then allow the users to log into the system and then also log out from the system. And on the server side, you are tracking a logged in user using the session and using the cookie on the client side. And when the user logs out, the cookie is destroyed on the client side. With this, we complete this exercise. This is a good time for you to do a git commit with the message Express Sessions Part 2.